Hello, folks. How are you doing? It is a lovely, lovely afternoon. I guess we got going a couple minutes early, and that's just the way it goes. Now is the time, if you haven't done it already, to make sure that you're subscribed. We all know that YouTube has a weird habit of unsubscribing people. So to make sure that does not happen to you, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to hit the bell so you get notifications, so you can always be sure to join us. And now is the time to hit that thumbs up, that like button. Make sure that everyone knows that you love what we're doing here. Good afternoon to everyone. I see that Space Communist, Arthur Porter, and Kinky are all with us, and I'm glad that all of you are here. Shout out to Lady Ravenhair in New Jersey. Shout out to Maupin Time. We're all here, we're all happy, we're all enjoying ourselves. Folks, now is the time if you haven't done it already. If you have not done it already, now is the time to share this on your page. Say, hey, I'm watching Caleb Maupin live. Join the fun, join the conversation. Now is the time to tweet this out, to bring other people into the conversation. Go to your Twitter. You don't even have to put any comments. Just put the link. Just tweet out the link, right? You don't have to say anything. Or you can tweet it out with something perhaps amusing. You can say, oh, Caleb's on there talking. What's this about? Or he just started. Or something odd, something that wouldn't exactly be clear. But make this a bigger conversation. Let folks know that you're watching. Bring people on board. I see that Alex Giovanni is with us. Hello, friends and comrades, he says. Well, I'm glad you're here, Alex Giovanni. I'm glad you're all here. We have so much to talk about. I saw that someone from Bulgaria is here. Very exciting. Neon Noir is here. Very, very exciting. Yes, so much that we can talk about today. I have a full agenda, but I'm sure that you all have things you want me to talk about. The 100% surefire way to get me to talk about something is to send me a super chat. You all know that. And I like super chats anyway, even if you don't want me to talk about something. But I will also be responding to other comments that people make. It's your show, folks. I'm just the voice on the other end of the camera, the voice and the face on the other end of the camera. You are what makes this happen. We are a community. You, me, all of us. Together, we are a community. And we do this every week without fail. The show must go on. I couldn't be happy without this, folks. This is the highlight of my week. Sitting down here on YouTube Live with you, hearing what you have to say, talking about the world, talking about politics, talking about international events, talking about history, talking about art and literature and music and all the important things that we talk about. Such a higher level than so much of what is on the web these days, right? We are engaging on a level that you don't quite often get across the interwebs, or the what do you call them? The information superhighway, as they used to call it on the internet. Folks, as we move towards starting, because I believe it is now officially 5 o'clock, and we are getting going. I see that Tommy Faras is with us. Christopher Semenchik is with us. As we get started, folks, I want to let you all know that there is absolutely no reason for the United States to continue its military presence in Iraq. Absolutely none whatsoever. There was no reason for the USA to send its forces in and invade Iraq in 2003. There's been no justification for the USA to remain in Iraq. That's been clear. Americans voted for Barack Obama because they believed he would withdraw U.S. military forces from Iraq. That did not happen. Americans voted also for U.S. President Donald J. Trump because he said that he would withdraw forces from Iraq, and that didn't happen. There has been no justification for U.S. military intervention in Iraq. The USA originally invaded Iraq because they said Iraq was planning to develop weapons of mass destruction, and if we don't invade, there could be a mushroom cloud over a city or something like that. Iraq tried to buy aluminum tubes or something, and that all turned out to be a hoax. That was fake news. Do you all remember that? It all turned out to be fake, and Colin Powell went to the United Nations, and he had photographs and charts and graphs to prove that Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government were planning to develop all these weapons, and they had this weapons program, and then Iraq was invaded, and it turned out all to be a hoax. A big, giant hoax. Fake news. Not real. False. And then, as folks may recall, the justification for being in Iraq was, well, we were there to provide the Iraqi people with freedom, even though the USA is aligned with some of the most brutal dictatorships in the world, like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Right? Furthermore, we were told that there was some kind of connection between the Iraqi Ba'athist Arab Socialist secular government and the 9/11 hijackers, who were Wahhabis, most of whom were from Saudi Arabia, and who were followers of Osama bin Laden, one of the wealthiest families in Saudi Arabia. So the whole thing didn't add up. There was no justification for the invasion of Iraq. There's no justification for continued presence. And now, more than ever, the Iraqi people are completely unified in wanting the United States out. There was just a demonstration in Iraq. If you don't believe me, look at what mainstream media has even said about it. Millions of people in Iraq have taken to the streets to make it clear that they do not want the United States to continue its military presence in their country. The Iraqi government, the parliament of Iraq, has voted overwhelmingly, ordering the United States to leave Iraq. The international community, the European Union countries, Russia, China, they want the United States to leave Iraq. There was no justification for invading Iraq to begin with. But now, the United States leaving Iraq and withdrawing its forces is becoming a matter of burning urgency. The killing of Qasem Soleimani, the escalation with Iran, Iran positioning itself to be the champion of the Iraqi people and their desire to remove U.S. forces, all of this is heading in a very, very dangerous direction. The Iraqis, at this point, have been having massive demonstrations against the U.S. government. And John F. Kennedy, a president of the United States, very famously said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And it's interesting that John F. Kennedy said that because similar things were said by William Z. Foster when he was on trial for being a member of the Communist Party. He made clear the Communist Party did not advocate a violent revolution, but if the capitalists made it impossible for the people to carry out a peaceful democratic transition to socialism, then it would be the capitalists and the bosses that chose a violent revolution. Abraham Lincoln, right, wanted to carry out a peaceful revolution and install an anti-slavery government in Washington, D.C. He didn't even want to abolish slavery, but he came into office making clear that he would not allow slavery to expand to new states. He would not be enforcing the fugitive slave law. And in response to the refusal on the part of the Southern plantation owners and their allies in the British Empire to allow this peaceful revolution, this installation of an anti-slavery government in Washington, D.C., a mildly anti-slavery government, a government that wasn't even going to abolish slavery, but just was not going to act as its champion, was in response to their refusal to allow this peaceful revolution, that the violent revolution known as the Civil War, Marxists call it the Second American Revolution, took place, and it was very bloody. More Americans died in the Civil War than any war since. Why? Well, we were on both sides of it, and the civilian population was often caught in the middle. The U.S. Civil War was a horrendous occurrence. And if the slave owners had simply said, you know what, we lost this one, we lost the election, the anti-slavery forces, whether they be industrial capitalists, religious abolitionists, labor unionists, they outnumber us. They outnumber us. I guess we lost. If they would have allowed that peaceful revolution, the election of Abraham Lincoln, an anti-slavery president, to take office, there would not have been a bloody civil war. However, they refused to allow that peaceful revolution, and so we got the most violent revolution, the most violent war in all of American history. Right? Never has there been that much bloodshed on American soil as there was during the U.S. Civil War. And folks, if the USA does not withdraw its forces from Iraq soon, things in Iraq are going to get very, 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 very ugly. It's pretty clear the Iraqis are unified. Sunni, Shia, Christian, secular. They are unified in wanting the United States to withdraw from the country. They want the USA out of their country. That's what they want. And it seems like the United States is trying to escalate the situation and turn Iraq into a battlefield. It seems like the USA is very much looking to have a proxy war against Iran in Iraq. Now, there are a lot of Iraqis that really like Iran. There are a lot of Iraqi Shia Muslims who've seen how Iran has sent its forces to protect their communities and protect their neighborhoods, has helped them to establish armed militias to protect their neighborhoods, has given support and given financial aid and helped build infrastructure. There are a lot of Iraqis who like Iran. On the other hand, there are a lot of Iraqis who do not like Iran. There are a lot of Iraqis who hold, the blood from the bad blood from the Iraq-Iran war, a horrendous conflict. There are a lot of Iraqis who have resentment against Persians. They are Arabs. The Iraqis are an Arab people. The Iranians are Persians. It's a different ethnicity, and there's a history of differences there. There's a lot of Iraqis that are Sunnis and don't like Shia, and the Iranian government is a Shia Muslim government. So there are a lot of Iraqis who don't like Iran. There are a lot of Iraqis who do like Iran. Regardless, all of the Iraqis seem pretty darn unified in not wanting, and absolutely not wanting, their homeland turned into the battlefield, the proxy battlefield, the proxy war battlefield between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's blatantly clear. Whether the Iraqis don't like Iran, whether the Iraqis do like Iran, they don't want their neighborhoods, their villages, their towns, their cities to become the battlefield for a huge proxy war between the anti-imperialist Iranian government and the U.S. imperialist government. They don't want that. They want the United States to withdraw, and they want Iraq for Iraqis, and they want to negotiate their own, to resolve their relationship with Iran their own way. The Iraqi people overwhelmingly have spoken in wanting the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. And it seems that the killing of Qasem Soleimani, all of the events that have just happened, are setting the stage for the war in Iraq, which has been ongoing. There's been killing and fighting in Iraq since the U.S. invaded in 2003. All of these events are setting the stage for things in Iraq to explode in a very, very, very ugly and violent way. The supreme leader of Iran, in his recent remarks, said that the real revenge of Iran for the killing of Soleimani would be driving American forces from the region. That's what he said. It wouldn't be this missile strike on U.S. bases, which we're now learning. We're now learning they lied. They lied, folks. They said there were no casualties, no injuries to U.S. troops from the bombing. Well, we now know that there were a number of U.S. troops that were treated for injuries following those bombings, following the Iranian missile strike against the U.S. bases. So that was a lie. The government lied. Iran is capable of inflicting a lot more damage to the United States. Folks, the U.S. needs to withdraw its military forces from Iraq. Folks, if you believe the things said by the U.S. government and its media puppets in the lead up to wars and military confrontations, I pity you. I really do. As Kinky says, surprise, surprise, they lied. I really pity you, deeply. I pity you. Folks, do you remember the chemical attack in Douma? Do you remember how Bashar Assad, quote unquote, gassed his own people, and it was time to invade Syria to overthrow this evil dictator Bashar Assad because he gassed his own people, and it was just absolutely true, and there was no question about it, and it was just a fact. And do you remember how a BBC top producer has now come forward and says that that video was staged? A top BBC producer, one of the main networks of Britain, of the UK, has come forward and basically said he's pretty well convinced the video that BBC and all the other networks were running to convince us that it was time to invade Iraq, it was staged. And now the UN OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, one of the people who was a weapons inspector who visited the site, has himself confirmed. His name is Ian Henderson. He was a weapons inspector. And he has himself confirmed that the chemical weapons were not dropped from an airplane. Instead, they were manually placed. The canisters of chemical weapons were not dropped from an airplane. What you saw on TV about Douma probably was not the Syrian government mercilessly gassing its own people. The story is falling apart. Every day, it seems, more and more evidence comes out that they were once again lying, just like they were lying about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Once again, they were lying. And members of the OPCW inspection team have said this. Emails have been leaked revealing this. Furthermore, we now have a weapons inspector himself, Ian Henderson, coming out and saying that he doesn't believe what was in the officially OPCW report. Folks, they lie in order to get us into wars. We know about the Gulf of Tonkin that was used as the justification for the Vietnam War. They do this over and over and over again. They lie in order to get us into wars. Folks, Afghanistan. Look at Afghanistan. The USA has been in Afghanistan for well over 16 years at this point. Well over 16 years. The longest war in all of U.S. history at this point. And what has the U.S. gotten out of it? We now know, as a result of documents that have been released from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction and other revelations that have come forward, that U.S. construction companies and Pentagon contractors have been paying money to the Taliban. We're supposed to be at war with the Taliban, but the Pentagon contractors were paying out protection money. Before they built a building, they would go to the Taliban and say, hey, Taliban, we'll give you, tens of thousands of dollars if you don't blow us up. Seriously. We do know that the opium poppy fields of Afghanistan have blossomed since the U.S. invasion. It is utter chaos. Iraq has been in chaos since the U.S. invasion in 2003. Afghanistan has been in chaos since the U.S. invasion of 2002. This is a disaster, folks. They lie to get us into wars, and the U.S. public doesn't want these wars to happen. And the U.S. public has voted for presidents that said that the wars would end. Folks, the USA needs to withdraw from Iraq. The USA needs to withdraw from that entire region, whether it be Central Asia and Afghanistan, the Middle East. The USA needs to get out of there. Needs to get out of there. There's nothing for the American people to gain from these continued military, quote-unquote, adventures. And we have everything to lose. Everything to lose. As our roads aren't properly paved, our water's not properly purified, we have an educational system that is a joke, that is a complete joke. right? Our universities, we aren't even churning out the proper number of engineers and scientists that we need. Folks, we need to end U.S. military intervention around the world, and the USA urgently needs to withdraw its forces from Iraq. No question about it. That's just the reality of the situation. And it's what the American people want, it's what the Iraqi people want, it's what Europe wants, it's what Russia wants, it's what China wants, it's what everyone wants, except the Wall Street billionaire banker monopolists that dominate the United States. They don't want it. War is a racket. That's what Smedley Butler, the general of the U.S. Marine Corps, who exposed the coup against Roosevelt, after he left the U.S. military and became a civilian, he wrote a book called War is a Racket. And in that book, U.S. Marine Corps General Smedley Butler exposed how throughout his entire military career, when he was in countries like Guatemala, when he was sent to China to protect Christian missionaries from the Boxer Rebellion, wherever he went, he was doing the dirty work of huge corporations. That's the reality. And that big corporations were making lots of money back then from war. War is a racket. But it's not the American people that gain from this racket. The people who gain from this racket are people with names like Carnegie, DuPont, Morgan. That's the reality of the situation, folks. War is a racket. The working class is sent to fight. Increasingly now, it's people who want green cards who are sent to fight. People who desperately want their U.S. citizenship. Green card soldiers, as they call them, people from Central America are sent to fight. Thank you, Neon Noir, for your super chat. And it is Wall Street that makes lots of profits, and we, the American people, lose. This must end. This must end. This must stop. The disaster of war in the 21st century must come to an end. What I'm saying to you folks might sound like common sense. This may be kindergarten leftism, right? Kindergarten communism, kindergarten analysis. But many people don't quite understand it. As much as people don't want these wars. Caleb, my mom and I promote the book as oft as possible. We think it should be handed out at high school graduation, says Lisa Hauserman. I think she's referring to the book War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. And it should be. People should understand what he pointed out so long ago. He wrote that book before the Second World War even happened. That was in the 1930s. A great American named Smedley Butler exposed Wall Street's business plot to attempt a coup against Roosevelt. This is the reality of the situation, folks. War is a racket, and we lose. All right? And I got to tell you, folks, the purpose of these wars at this point is to sow chaos and instability. Why is the USA, and thank you, Yogi Fish, why is the USA in Afghanistan? Well, it was to get rid of the Taliban, who was supposedly harboring Osama bin Laden. Well, Osama bin Laden's dead, according to all reports. Many people don't even buy the way he died, but regardless, Osama bin Laden is dead. The Taliban is very strong. The opium dealers are very strong. Why is the USA in Afghanistan? Look at who borders Afghanistan. Iran, Russia, and China. The instability of Afghanistan, the terrorist groups, the drug dealers, the chaos that flows from U.S. military occupation spills over into Iranian borders, where Iran has to deal with a huge opium addiction problem in Iran. Huge. Heroin in Iran, it's almost 1% of the population of Iranians have an addiction to heroin. It is a huge problem in Iran. There's a park in Tehran, in the capital. They refer to it as Needle Park. And thank you, Fred. And they refer to it as Needle Park because everyone knows that's where you go to buy heroin in the capital. And in order to try and make a statement about the need to shut that down, the mayor of Tehran moved his home right next to that park. I actually heard about that when I was in Iran. Right? Why is the USA? Why is the USA in Afghanistan. It's about spilling chaos into Russia, destabilizing Russia. It's about spewing chaos over into China, right? We know about the Uyghur regions and some of the problems they've had with knife attacks and how Wahhabism and fanatical terrorist extremism now in Afghanistan, an unstable Afghanistan, flows over the border into China. This is an ongoing issue. Afghanistan is a strategic center of destabilization. That's basically what it is. The same for Iraq, right? The point is to sow chaos, to beat down competitors. And Iran is a competitor. Russia is a competitor on the oil and gas markets. China is a competitor on the smartphone markets, on the steel markets, on the manufacturing basis. These are rivals of the huge Western multinational corporations. And they don't want these rivals to continue to prosperously grow, so they strategically sow chaos. Now, Simran is saying, can China embarrass the West into central planning? I don't know exactly how that would work. But I don't know if folks read Jamie Dimon or watched Jamie Dimon, the head of Chase Bank, when he spoke to Davos. Now, I skimmed his speech. Jamie Dimon is Chase Bank, right? That's the Rockefeller Oil Bank. That's ExxonMobil. That's Standard Oil. That's J.P. Morgan. It's J.P. Morgan Chase. So that's the Morgans, right? General Electric. All in one giant financial institution, the biggest bank in the world. And Jamie Dimon, in his speech, he criticizes socialism. He's opposed to socialism, he says we have to make capitalism work better. And if you read it, it's very much a liberal speech. You can some of what he says almost sounds like Bernie Sanders. He's saying we need to make capitalism work so we don't have the danger of socialism. And that's what he's saying, and that's the view of the richest of the rich in the United States at this time. They want more control over the economy to be exercised in the hopes that they can hold off the coming uprising. An uprising is coming. The coming insurrection is upon us, right? Trump was stage one. Maybe Occupy Wall Street was before that. Black Lives Matter. There is a coming explosion in U.S. society, and everyone knows it. And we're already seeing these seeds of the fire. It's happening. However, the hope is that they can manage things. Right? That's the hope. And Jamie Dimon and many of the voices at Davos, such as George Soros, are saying that's what is absolutely needed now. They need more control and regulation over capitalism in order to prevent the coming explosion. That's what's going on there. Right? Listen to the voices coming out of Davos. They are not socialists. They're not Marxists and revolutionaries. They are smarter, managerial-minded capitalists who are saying, we see what's on the horizon. All the people that we pay and give grant money to and fund to do all kinds of research have been telling us for a long time that things are going to explode. And then Donald Trump got elected president of the United States. And then Brexit happened. And there is a crisis coming in Western countries. And it's already, look at the streets of France, folks. Look at the streets of France. Look at the yellow vest movement. It's happening, folks. It's already started. The explosion has already started, and it's only a matter of time before it explodes even further. Capitalism has created chaos. It's created chaos in Iraq. It's created chaos in Afghanistan. It has created chaos in Latin America. And that chaos is coming home, folks. And we want the chaos to end. We want the economy to be organized in a rational way, not to serve the profits of a small group of owners, but to serve the people. We want a rationally planned economy where things get done because it is for the benefit of the community, not because it's in the short-term interest of some private business owner who wants to make profits. We don't want chaos. We don't want violence. We don't want instability. We want order. We want order to reassert itself. I've got more to say about that later in the conversation. But folks, why don't I do that thing that I often do here on the lives where you tell me where you are. You give me your name and your location, and I call you out as I see you, because I would like to know who you are. And after that, I am going to make a very, very big announcement, a very important announcement. So let's hear it, folks. Who's with me? Who's here? Names and locations. Lexington, Kentucky, Ryan Overstreet. Mississippi, JT24. Orlando, Florida, Fred Siberian. San Diego, Brandon. Tim Stacy in Kentucky. Lawrence Chu in Albany. Jacob Maxey in Louisiana. Tina from Wisconsin. Hi, Caleb from the Philippines. Troy in Los Angeles. Zurich, Switzerland. Joshua Tree, California. Tampa, Florida. Warsaw, Poland. Cleveland. Jamaica. Santa Fe, New Mexico. Maine. Austin, Texas. New York. Ireland. Australia. Amsterdam, Kentucky. West by God, Virginia. Grand Rapids, Michigan. Melbourne, Australia. Buffalo, New York. Zurich, the Netherlands. Bayonne, New Jersey. Greetings from Belgium. Racine, Wisconsin. Hawaii. Southern California. People are power in Australia. Talent in Oregon. North Carolina. Dust James. Scotland. Edinburgh, says Stephen Rudden. Southern Maine. Ranger Jenny. Long Island, New York. Will Lotz. Folks. If you haven't done it already, San Diego, Tommy Farras. Toronto, Nathaniel Adams. Shaniqua McAdams in Buffalo, New York. Folks, if you haven't done it already, now is the time to share this on Facebook. Just cut and paste the link. You don't even have to make any comment. Now is the time to tweet this out. You can just tweet it out without any comment, or you can tweet out, oh my God, did you hear what Caleb just said? Or, oh, just started watching this, interesting. Now is the time to tweet this out and make it a bigger conversation, because the more the merrier. We are a growing community here. I couldn't do this without you. You couldn't do this without me. We are all here together. It is a miserable day here in Brooklyn. The sun just went down, but I must tell you, the rain, it was pretty awful. I went to a nice little Mexican restaurant in my neighborhood and sat and read the Wall Street Journal and caught up on world events and ate, some nachos and drank some of that diet beverage that will not be named. And it was raining and pouring and miserable outside. And then, just about the time I wanted to leave, the sun came out. It was beautiful. And I walked outside, and the rain stopped, and I looked up at the sky. All of a sudden, it was bright. It was a sunny day. And I saw the rainbow, the bright colors. And I thought about what people have been doing for thousands of years, right? Waiting for that peace that comes after the storm. Waiting for reassurance that there is order in the universe and that chaos will not prevail. That feeling that scientists get when they discover a new law or a new reality about the universe, or they confirm a hypothesis. That feeling that great musicians get when they put together and compose a piece of music that just makes the audience feel good. That feeling that all of us get when things are working out, when we're reassured that there is indeed order in the universe. But that order has a relationship with chaos. There is chaos in the universe, but order wins out in the end. And that is what all of us human beings strive for, is seeing that moment where order prevails over chaos, where chaos is not allowed to run rampant, but right and wrong are reasserted, truth is established, reality is confirmed, there is indeed order, and there is human progress, and we can move ahead to a tomorrow that is better than today. That is the human experience, longing for order, and overcoming and enduring the horrors of chaos. And that is something I've written about extensively. It's something I wrangle with in my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. And when Book 2 comes out, as I continue to plow ahead writing Book 2, that will be a big theme of what I write. But folks, shout out to Kazuya in Brooklyn, New York. Folks, the big announcement that I'm going to make. I don't have all of the details here for you, but they will be coming shortly. But on April 18th, that's a few months from now, mark your calendar, April 18th, I will be convening a conference in Weehawken, New Jersey. Beautiful, beautiful hotel, folks. Beautiful hotel. Just went there, reserved it. We got a really nice big room. And we're going to be having a conference. Not just me, but a few other folks. And we're going to establish a think tank. I'm not involved in political stuff. As you know, I don't endorse any candidates, so I can remain objective in my reporting, and I don't agree. I mean, the reality is there's no candidate who agrees with me on everything. I don't endorse any candidates. I don't run for office. I don't campaign for people. But as we talk about on these lives, we do have a very specific perspective on world events. We believe in socialism. We are opposed to the anarchy of production and the chaos of the market. And I want to facilitate conversations about socialism. So, on April 18th, the Center for Political Innovation will be convening a conference in New Jersey. It'll be all day, 11 in the morning to 9 o'clock at night, many different speakers and presentations. You'll definitely be hearing from me. I'll be giving the keynote. But some other friends of mine will definitely be involved. Different forces are going to be involved, and it's going to be a great event. Now, soon you'll be able to pre-register to attend. It's going to be very, very exciting. It will be like no other conference you've been to. I have been to a lot of socialist conferences over the years. And I would say almost all of them disappointed me. This one will not disappoint you. This is what those conferences should have been. A one-day mini conference hotel, and it's a beautiful hotel, just looking across the river. You can see Manhattan across the river. April 18th. It's going to be great. So I hope you can make it. I hope you can make it. I'll see you there. It's going to be very, very, very exciting. I hope to do one on the West Coast in the fall. That is my goal. But as of now, we will be having a one-day mini conference, Saturday, April 18th in New Jersey. Pretty soon, you'll be able to make your reservation or make your registration. So mark your calendar, book your flight. It's happening, folks. The hotel is reserved. Do you have any interesting facts about the Korean War? Well, I do. And thanks for the super chat. I do appreciate it. The Korean War, they call it the Unknown War. The Unknown War. There was actually a documentary about it that they wouldn't show on American television because they thought Americans couldn't handle it. Dr. Bruce Cummings, a brilliant writer, has written extensively, the leading North Korea scholar in the United States, Dr. Bruce Cummings, who I had the honor of meeting and spending a little time with when I was in college. We talked about how much we both enjoy Anna Louise Strong. He doesn't agree with me. He's not from my perspective, but just a brilliant writer. He wrote Korea's Place in the Sun, North Korea, Another Country. Just an expert on all things Korean, going back to like medieval times, Korean culture and myth and legend. And he worked to create a documentary about the realities of the Korean War. And the documentary that he made was considered not fit for American audiences. Every building above 1 story tall in North Korea was bombed during the Korean War. Can you imagine every single building above 1 story tall being destroyed? The horrendous atrocities that were committed against the Korean people during the Korean War have not been forgotten. Right? The Korean War was a disaster, but it was also a huge epic defeat for the United States. The USA went in there and was defeated. It tried to drive socialism out of the Korean Peninsula, and at the end of the war, they didn't sign a treaty. There was an armistice agreement, and North Korea was exactly where they were at the beginning. The USA went in there hoping to just drive socialism and communism out of the Korean Peninsula and then use that as a base to go into China. They couldn't do it. Folks will recall that Douglas MacArthur, the general threatened to drop atomic bombs on China if they got involved in the Korean War. And President Truman fired him for doing that, because you cannot threaten the use of the atomic bomb without the president's consent. And that was a big deal. President Truman said, we don't have a military government in the United States. And still to this day, many Korean right-wingers and many Republicans and right-wingers in the USA think that that was wrong. Think it was wrong for Truman to fire a military general. They think that MacArthur was a hero for threatening to drop the atomic bomb, not one Hiroshima, not one Nagasaki on China, but 5 times on China. But China got involved. And I bet you didn't know that Mao Zedong's own son died in the Korean War. When the USA invaded Iraq, the Bush twins were not among the casualties, right? When Obama continued the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, when Obama intervened and killed Gaddafi and toppled the socialist government of Libya, Malika and his children were not among those who fought and risked their lives. But Mao Zedong's own son died in the Korean War, just like Stalin's own son died defending the Soviet Union from Hitler. These countries have a very different way of doing things, right? It's the concept. It's interesting. You get a lot of like young Maoists, and they'll talk about people's war. Well, Mao did not invent the concept of people's war, actually. That concept came much earlier from Dr. Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang, or the KMT nationalist movement. A people's war is a war in which the entire population is mobilized, in which the entire population makes sacrifices. And he contrasted it, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, contrasted a people's war with the wars that China had been having for centuries. The wars between warlords, where peasants were forced to fight against their will and did everything they could to get out of fighting and injured themselves. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, in order to defeat the warlords, in order to unify China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen put forward, he said, we have to have a new kind of war. We have to have a people's war, right? A war of the entire people. A war where the people's lives are on the line, where the people are defending their own interests, and the people are fully mobilized to fight it. Very, very, very different. Very, very different concept. And that was a big concept of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, is that we don't need to have these wars where people are reluctantly fighting for one warlord or one landlord or one corrupt oligarch against another. We need to have a people's war. And the Soviet Union's resistance to the Nazi invasion was a people's war. And the war on the Korean Peninsula, in which thousands and thousands of Chinese people poured in to support the Korean people as they fought for their lives, and millions of them died. 4 to 5 million Korean people died in that war. That was a people's war. There was only one demonstration in the United States against the Korean War. Interesting fact. I know this because I knew someone, she died, who was there. The Korean War took place at the height of McCarthyism in America, all right? The Communist Party was basically illegal. The National Board of the Communist Party had been put in prison at the Foley Square trial in 1948. They were found guilty of things that Karl Marx wrote, things that Lenin wrote, and they were put in federal prison. The Communist Party was functioning as an illegal organization. The FBI hounded them, all of that. But yet there was a single demonstration against the Korean War. And I was told by someone who was there what it was like. The woman's name was Frances Dostal. She was a founding member of the Workers' World Party, but she had grown up in the Communist Party. And she was a nurse. And she told me about how she was just working at a hospital in New York, and somebody whispered to her, you really ought to be in Times Square at a certain time this coming Saturday. And how? 1950, 1951, Times Square, a group of people gathered, plain clothes, suits and ties. No one saw anything coming. And then out of the blue, they unfurled a banner, U.S. out of the Korean Peninsula. And immediately, an army of police came at them with clubs and beat them and injured them. And how then they dispersed and ran away and went one block down, one square down Broadway to Madison Square. And assembled very discreetly until one person gave the signal, and suddenly they unfurled that banner, and then an army of police came down on them. And then they reassembled at Union Square, unfurled that banner, and the police came down on them. They did this from Times Square all the way down to Foley Square. Thousands of them were injured. It was illegal. You couldn't have anti-war demonstrations in the United States. You couldn't be in the Communist Party. But the Young Communist League, in the middle of McCarthyism, staged this rally against the Korean War. And a number of its organizers were arrested and got very serious charges for having that peaceful demonstration. And Frances, this older woman that I knew, she was there, and she described it to me. And how that was a time when everything communist in the United States was hush, hush, whisper, whisper. But even then, the Communist Party was able to have a single peace rally in New York City against the Korean War, right? We all know about the anti-Vietnam War stuff. That was huge. But the anti-war movement during the Korean War was very, very secretive and isolated. But yet, the Korean War ended because the public started to turn against it. After a year or so, the U.S. public suddenly was weary because the memories of World War II were still fresh in their minds, and the U.S. public wasn't really behind it. And as weird as that sounds, they started to back away. A lot of the GIs from Korea have very interesting things to say. There's a lot of documentaries. You should see the documentary Ghosts of Jeju. And it talks about a horrendous massacre at Jeju Island, right? In southern Korea, there's one Korea, but in the southern part of the Korean peninsula, there's an island called Jeju. And that island was a stronghold of communism, right? There was trade unions there were democratic activists, and when Park Chung-hee declared himself the military dictator, not Park Chung-hee, I'm sorry, when Syngman Rhee declared himself the military dictator in South Korea, in the Republic of Korea, and established that military dictatorship, that island had been a stronghold of opposition. And so U.S. troops and the military, Korean military, went there and slaughtered thousands of people. It was a horrendous incident, the massacre at Jeju Island, right? There's a very good documentary, Ghosts of Jeju, and it interviews American soldiers who were participating in that massacre. And they recall, they just slaughtered. This area had been a stronghold of communist sympathy. They had wanted... What was the Korean War about, folks? What was the Korean War about? You say, well, North Korea invaded South Korea. Well, no. What happened was that as World War II ended, right, Japan had been the colonizer of Korea, and Kim Il-sung had been the outlaw hero of the Korean people. He was the legendary hero of the resistance to Japan. Kim Il-sung means Kim becomes the sun. It was like Billy the Kid or Pretty Boy Floyd. He was a heroic outlaw. He was the Robin Hood of North Korea, of Korea, basically. He hid in the mountains, and he led this resistance to Japan. That was Kim Il-sung. And when the war ended, the agreement was that there would be a free election on the entire Korean peninsula. And the Communist Party would participate. And the Social Democratic Party would participate. And the Christian Party would participate. And all would be allowed to participate except for those who had collaborated with the Japanese occupiers. And the United States refused to allow a Korean Peninsula-wide free election. And that's why the Korean War happened. Not only would the United States not allow this election to happen, you had Syngman Rhee declaring himself the military dictator. You had the massacre of the peoples living at Jeju Island that were strong advocates of the Communist Party and the Korean Workers' Party. And in response, In response, the Korean people felt they had an obligation to protect their comrades who were being slaughtered. That's what the Korean War was about. The Korean War was not, crazy North Korean aggression. It was not, quote unquote, Stalinist expansionism, as the Trotskyites called it. The Korean War was a battle for democracy. And still to this day, the position of North Korea is they favor peaceful democratic reunification of the Korean Peninsula. They want a continent-wide election, a peninsula-wide election, in which the Communist Party, it's now called the Korean Workers' Party. It was a merger of the Christian Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Communist Party, all into one party under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. They want a continent-wide, a peninsula-wide free election. That's what they want. And, they've agreed, they've stated many times that the South could maintain its political system and the North could maintain theirs. They want the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and they want American troops out. And a lot of Korean people in the South also want American troops out. There have been massive protests and demonstrations in South Korea, right? South Korea has been, for the majority of the time since the end of the Second World War, South Korea has been a military dictatorship. Park Chung-hee, Syngman Rhee, it was not a free country for the majority of the time. That's an illusion. We say free South Korea, dictatorship North Korea. Well, South Korea has had a lot of authoritarian governments, and their national security laws that are still on the books are quite harsh. In South Korea, you cannot, a young man retweeted Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il's on Twitter, and he went to jail for doing that. He was given a sentence, a jail term for a tweet, right under there. Read what Human Rights Watch, of all people, says about the national security laws in South Korea. Read about the April Revolution, where the Korean students rose up and toppled the dictatorship. Read about the student uprisings that happened in the 1980s on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, the Korean people overwhelmingly, there's a whole lot of anger at the presence of American troops there. The current president, Moon Jae-in, was elected after a wave of disgust with the Park regime, the daughter who was in with the United States. So, yes, I'm taking a long time to answer that super chat, but you want me to talk about the Korean War? That's what's there to talk about, the Korean War. I said this, sure, I said it on Lionel's show, as Kinky is pointing out. I'll say it anywhere. North Korea is a country that has a lot of difficulties. And, they are locked down and they are resisting. And I am not going to tell you that North Korea is a paradise. I would never say that. I'm not going to tell you that the Korean government has never done anything wrong. Not going to say that. I'm not going to say that I endorse their policies or endorse the way they are, because they don't endorse the way they are. They are locked and loaded and fighting for their lives, right? They are in a state of war, trying to survive. This is not heaven on earth. This is not true communism being enacted. This is a group of people that have been locked down and fighting for the reunification of their homeland, right? And they're still technically at war with the United States, even with Trump visiting and everything. Right? The USA has never fully recognized the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and they're locked and loaded and they're fighting for their lives. Right? That's what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. There's no need to idealize them. There's no need to present them as being some ideal state, because they're not. They're fighting for their lives, right? And a lot of the problems that they have there are rooted in that fact. When a country is fighting for its life, when it's facing huge international sanctions, when it's got weapons pointed at it, under such circumstances, countries lock down and they don't become human rights paradises. They don't become, it's a state of war. And human rights is rooted in economic development and prosperity. A more prosperous a society is, a more stable a society is, the less under constant threat of invasion and foreign attack a country is, the more free it can be. And that is left out of the conversation, I think. People want to make it sound that freedom exists in a vacuum, right? Well, no, freedom doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? And that the more North Korea is attacked, the more authoritarian it's going to be out of necessity. And that's just a reality. DPRK faces huge, horrendous sanctions. And during the 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell, when basically there was a petrodollar monopoly. You could only buy oil in dollars. North Korea's food system came to a grinding halt because they're a mountainous country. They're the mountainous part of the Korean Peninsula, and they needed petroleum in order to run their tractors and to keep their food system going, and they couldn't get it, and people starved to death. And they call it the arduous March period. It was horrendous. This is the situation. So that's what I want to talk about. I remember when I was in Ecuador in 2013. And thank you, Simran. I don't want to talk about that. I'm not going to get into that. Sorry, but thank you. I don't want to get into Philippine stuff. But in terms of Ecuador, I was in Ecuador for the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2013. Someone's asking about Correa. Yes, Correa came and spoke to the festival. He gave a great speech. I was in the audience when he gave that speech. But I remember one of the most beautiful things about that festival, and I went, to the next World Festival of Youth and Students, the one they held in Sochi in Russia. But I attended the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador. And what I remember, one of the things I remember most vividly about the festival in 2013 was the North Korean choir. The North Korean choir. And, every one of the big plenaries that they had at the big stage at the festival, this choir from North Korea would sing. And they didn't just sing Korean traditional songs. They did. They also sang songs from classical music, Italian, Pellicola, Funicola. They sang Italian opera. They sang Beethoven. But they also, I'll never forget, they actually did perform the song Guantanamera, the Cuban folk song. I don't know if folks know Guantanamera. They performed it, and I remember sitting there and hearing the North Korean choir perform Guantanamera in Quito, Ecuador, and it was beautiful. It was just a beautiful moment, to hear them perform that. And, that song Guantanamera, it is one of the most loved songs in Cuba. It's kind of a folk melody from Cuba. It's got a salsa vibe to it. But it was made popular in the United States among, non-Latinos by Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger, the folk musician, actually made it popular. He would perform it. Good day, Caleb. How do you reconcile dialectical materialism with spiritual beliefs? How do you feel the Marxist world and spirituality? Writing it down. We'll get to that. All right. Writing it down. All right. Okay. But yeah, I remember when that performance happened, and it was important, and I wanted to talk about, and that's what led me to want to talk about something that I think is rather important, which is the relationship between folk music and communism. It's quite interesting. When you think about people in the United States who are famous and communists, two names pop into people's minds: Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. Woody Guthrie, communist. Pete Seeger, communist. Both of them were Communist Party members. Woody Guthrie never fully confirmed he was a Communist Party member, but he had a column in the Daily Worker newspaper when they would ask Woody Guthrie if he was a member, and thank you, Sebastian. Gang rise up. They would ask him if he was a Communist Party member. Woody Guthrie would jokingly say things like, "I never much cared for parties, but I've been in the red my whole life." He would give joking answers, but they knew he was a communist. I mean, if you have a column in the Daily Worker in the 1930s, you're pretty much a communist. Pete Seeger was actually a card-carrying party member. We know that for a fact. He joined in 1936. But the relationship between communism and folk music, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Okay, so first of all, the name that immediately comes to mind, I've already seen it in the chat, is Joe Hill. All right, Joe Hill was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, union activist in the United States. Shout out to Jenny Lynn, who just joined us. And, Joe Hill was a union activist, and he wrote music, sang songs for the Wobblies, the IWW union, the Industrial Workers of the World. Was he a folk musician? Yes, nowadays we would consider him to be a folk musician. Back then, he wouldn't have been considered a folk musician. The music he sang was just kind of popular music. It's actually kind of fascinating. So, we're talking way back, like 1900, 1910. The Industrial Workers of the World was a union. And it was a union that organized what they called unskilled workers, right? The AFL union, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, had a policy that it would only organize quote-unquote skilled workers, trades, craftsmen, people who had to have an apprenticeship, right? But if you worked in a factory, if you were a lumberjack, if you were a coal miner, if you worked in a steel mill, they were not gonna organize you. And there were a lot of traveling workers around the United States at that time. People who would go from town to town in order to work, especially in like Seattle, Oregon. There were a lot of loggers, right? And they would go from camp to camp and they would cut down trees for a living. And they would, they would get some work here and they'd be here for a couple months cutting down trees. Then they'd go somewhere else and cut down some trees. And, there were miners in Colorado, and there were a lot of them, and they were like permanently homeless. And they would just travel around the country, going from place to place to find work, and they were treated very, very badly, and people would rip them off and not pay them, and they had horrendous conditions, and they were just ruthlessly exploited, and the AFL union didn't want to organize them. So the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, emerged as a union that would organize them. Right? And it called for one big union for all workers. They read Marx, and they believed in Marxism. They were a little more anarcho-syndicalist. They focused on workers seizing their factories. They didn't believe in running candidates. They didn't believe in voting. They were more anarcho-syndicalist. They didn't want to sign contracts with employers because that would be recognizing the right of the employer to exploit workers. They wanted the workers to own the factories. That's what they were about. Workers ought to run the mills. Those who work in the mill ought to run it. That was IWW, syndicalism, anarcho-syndicalism, IWW. And the IWW was famous for what they had called free speech fights, where they would show up at a town and one of their members would get on a soapbox and start giving a speech, and then they would arrest them. And so then the next person would get up and give a speech. And some town would try to ban the IWW from giving speeches, so every IWW member in the whole country would flock to this town and fill up their jails and embarrass them and cause enough of a ruckus that the city would back down and allow their right to free speech. And you read about the Spokane free speech fight. It was very, very big, right? It was a massive thing where, thousands and thousands of wobblies and socialists and communists were getting arrested just for giving a speech until finally the city backs down. And all over the country, especially out west, right? The Northwest, places like that, California, you had a lot of IWW free speech fights in these little southern towns, that were trying to run things like the Wild West. And, we have a city ordinance that we don't allow communists to speak here. They were fighting for free speech. And the Wobblies were known for, they took the free speech stuff seriously. They were known for their soapbox agitators. They would get a soapbox and they'd have someone get up there and talk about the workers and the bosses. But part of their performance art, and this is what you have to remember, a big part of what the Wobblies did was just agitating, right? They went around and stirred up workers to resist the bosses. And a very big part of that, was performance art, right? And they would put on a show. They'd go to town squares, right? In New York City, Union Square was where the Wobblies always were. And they would just go to the city town square where people would go for some entertainment if they wanted to see something on Saturday night. And they would put on a show. And part of that was speeches and lectures about Marxism. Part of that was like little plays they would perform. And another big part of that was music. And the music that they performed, the reason it wasn't technically folk music was because at the time, it was simply whatever the popular music was, they would rewrite it to be about communism. That's basically what it was. They would rewrite popular songs of the time to be about communism, or to be about labor struggles, right? Like one of the big Joe Hill songs is called Ta-ra-ra Boom Die. Right? And that was actually a Broadway song. That was like a Broadway song. Ta-da-da-da-da-da, ta-da-da-da-da-da. And they rewrote it to be about like workplace sabotage, right? Another thing, at the time, there were all these hungry people and migrant workers. The Salvation Army was big, right? It fed hungry people and was pushing like an evangelical kind of Christian message. So they would take big hymns that the evangelical, Salvation Army did and rewrite them to be, communist, right? Like, by and by and stuff like that, right? And that was what the IWW was known for. They were known for this kind of street performance they would do that would lead one to socialist and communist conclusions. That's what they were known for. That's what the IWW was kind of known for. And Joe Hill was one of the main guys who wrote the songs that they performed, but they weren't considered folk music, right? It's a lot like, I don't know if people remember, maybe 10 years ago, some college kids, I don't remember who, they rewrote the song I Kissed a Girl, I Liked It, to I Read Some Marx and I Liked It, right? I read some Marx and I liked it, friend of the proletariat. Yeah, they rewrote it, right? You remember that? It was a big thing. That's basically what Joe Hill did. Is that folk music? Well, now it is. Back then it wasn't. It was just, some Weird Al Yankovic kind of stuff, right? I guess except instead of comedy, it was about politics. That's basically what it was, right? And it was popular, and we know that Joe Hill eventually was framed for murder and received the death penalty. He was executed by firing squad in the state of Utah, and it was horrendous. And it was just that was that, and that's was that folk music? I wouldn't call it folk music, right? Folk music is a little bit different. Folk music is when you're taking songs of the people, right? Songs that just kind of catch on. Songs where you don't really know who the author is. Songs that are in the style of popular songs. Like, for example, Brahms, the composer Brahms, right? We all know the classic lullaby. We've all heard it. Go to sleep, you are a little, little baby. Well, what is that? It's the Brahms lullaby. He didn't write it. Brahms went around and started listening to people in Germany and listening to the songs that people all just kind of knew, right? In Germany, probably for thousands of years, people were singing, go to sleep, you are my little, little baby, or whatever the hell it was, right? I don't know what the lyrics are, but they were singing that. No one knows who wrote that. Well, Brahms wanted to be a folk musician. So he went around and he listened to these songs that people just sang to get through life. The people just kind of entertained themselves with, right? And he made them into music. And that's kind of what folk music is. It's an attempt to take the music that is already among the people and celebrate it and make it stronger, right? That's what folk music really is. If anything, there's actually a very, very conservative side to folk music, if you think about it, right? It's saying that within the population at large, there are truths and there are aesthetics, and that's the aesthetic that you want to celebrate. It's what's already there. You're not trying to be an experimental composer. You're not trying to take something and do some big innovation. This isn't John Cage. It's the opposite, right? You listen, and people have been doing this for thousands of years, especially before there was radio, before there was TV, before there was anything. People just, to get by when they're bored, they start whistling a tune when they're walking down the street, and folk music as a movement was an attempt to take what people naturally do and celebrate it and amplify it. That's what folk music is, right? You can go even further back than Brahms. Beethoven. If you listen to the Pastoral Symphony by Beethoven, he has the Shepherd's Song, right? It's this triumphant melody in the seventh, in the Pastoral Symphony by Beethoven. Well, that pastoral, that melody, that Shepherd's Song, he didn't write that tune. That was a tune that was popular among shepherds and peasants, right? And people when they're bored on the job, when they're working, right? People when they're walking someplace and it's going to be a long way, they whistle a tune or they hum something. These songs that have just kind of been there. We don't know where they came from. Somebody made it up and somebody changed it and one thing led to another, and that's folk music, right? Some of the Shakespeare, right? And Shakespeare, right? At Shakespeare's time, in a lot of Shakespeare plays, they have songs. And we know what these songs are, but we don't quite know them, right? Greensleeves was a very popular song around the time of Shakespeare. Supposedly it was written by Henry VIII, but that's probably not true. But, it was one of the first songs played on the recorder. I mean, this is folk music. And there is a relationship between communism and folk music. There is, but it's not as obvious as you might think. People might just say, oh, communists, when they have rallies, people play guitars, that's folk music. No. Joe Hill, that's not really folk music. That's wobbly music, that's political music, but it wasn't folk music. Ta-ra-ra, boom-de-ay, Broadway, hymns, that's just what people were listening. He spoofed it. Folk music and the communist relationship with folk music starts during the Popular Front period. So you have to remember this. So you have the Communist International, the Comintern, right? The Comintern declares in 1928 that there's the third period. Third period. 1928, the Comintern declares the third period, right? That the Russian Revolution was the first period of revolution, and there was the second period of stabilization. But now, 1928, with the beginnings of the Great Depression and the rise of the Soviet Union's industrialization, marks the beginning of the third period. So during the third period, the Communist International is saying, class against class, they are struggling against social democrats who they believe are holding back the revolution. Class against class, and they want to build a united front from below. They start feeding unemployed workers and fighting for their rights. And that was their period. And during the period of the united front from below, in the third period, communists are really into like experimental music, for example. They're really into new innovations. They're really into jazz music, for example. They're really into doing the most cutting-edge, advanced thing because they're the future and capitalism is the past. They don't really have an interest in folk music. But the Popular Front is a shift. 1935, the Communist International has the 7th World Congress, right? And at the 7th World Congress, they declare that they must defeat fascism. That fascism, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, the Morgans, and Henry Ford in the United States, they must do everything they can to defeat fascism. And so in order to defeat fascism, they need to tap in to the national spirit of the country. They need to make sure that fascists, right? Because what are fascists, right? What's fascism all about? It's about saying we are for the nation. We represent the will of the nation. Communism is a foreign conspiracy, but we are the will of the nation. That's the fascist message. And the Popular Front orientation, if you read Georgia Dimitrov's speech to the 7th World Congress, the Popular Front orientation is to say, no, democracy is the spirit of the nation. That among the British people, among the French people, among the Italian people, among the American people, there is a movement for democracy. There is a movement for freedom. There is a movement for workers' rights. And that communists must find the progressive side of the national character of their country. They have to tap into the spirit of the people of their homeland, find the progressive elements, and build them up. And so they're not saying, we're going to burn the history of the past. We're going to only do experimental, advanced music. Oh, no, the communists are saying, we are going to say that we are the true inheritors of the democratic traditions within our people. We are going to carry the flame of our nation's history and legacy and point it in a progressive direction that leads toward the brotherhood of mankind and comradeship and friendship with people around the world and anti-fascism and democracy, ultimately leading to socialism, where the people of our country control the major banks and industries. And communists, their Popular Front, they were big supporters of Roosevelt. Communists, they were big supporters of many different artists. Right? I'm talking about Diego Rivera and his paintings and such. He was not a member of the Communist Party. He was a trot, but, they liked his art. And it was during that period, 1936, Pete Seeger, who was a young man who had attended Harvard University, he went and visited a folk music conference, a folk music convention in South Carolina, I think. But it was basically run by the communists. Because the communists said, we have to celebrate American folk and American culture. So Pete Seeger went to this conference, this communist-led folk music conference. And the Communist Party convened their members, and they had black musicians there, African-American spiritual singers. They had, they had folk singers from the Midwest. They had different people. And the communists in South Carolina, folks, can you think of a more conservative state? But the communists in South Carolina, a Jim Crow state, held a multiracial conference, a multiracial convention, where they had folk singers, white folk singers, black folk singers, religious folk singers, secular folk singers, all kinds of different people singing people's music. And Pete Seeger, who was studying music at Harvard University, attended this conference, and he fell in love with this kind of music, and he was a communist. He joined the Communist Party, and he became a folk musician. He was done with classical music. He wanted to be a folk musician. And that's that Popular Front period. That was the moment where communism and folk music unified. That's really the moment. All right? It's out of the Popular Front that communists start trying to do what Brahms did. They start trying to find the beauty within the people themselves and amplify it. Right? If you listen to it, the communists are not hiding their politics. No. You listen to that Pete Seeger music. He's pushing communism. Listen to the music. He's pushing communism. Absolutely. But he's doing it in a way that the people have already done. He's taking songs that Americans already sing and finding ways that it gives an expression to a progressive political message. That's what Woody Guthrie became famous for doing in the 1930s. He was practically a household name, Woody Guthrie, by doing this, singing songs that people already sang and highlighting the progressive side of it. Right? That is the nature of folk music, and that's the nature of communism's relationship with folk music. And if you listen to Woody Guthrie's music, if you listen to Pete Seeger's music, that's what it's about. Right? And you have the creation of People's Songs, the record label that they started, the Almanac Singers, all of that. It was following the communist policy, the Popular Front policy. And that's why it was so loved. These were the songs that people knew. These are songs people heard from their parents growing up. These are songs people sang in school. These are songs people sang when they were working and doing manual labor to get by. And it was communists giving a voice to that and then pushing it in a progressive message and nudging it in a progressive message. That was the basis of the communist relationship with folk music. And in the McCarthy period, during McCarthyism, this was one of the things that kept the communists going. Right? We know Peekskill, New York. Right? Peekskill, New York, the Communist Party tried to have a picnic and folk music concert. And the Ku Klux Klan and the American Legion attacked it. It was a riot. People were injured. People lost their eyes. And it was people were very badly injured and hurt. They tried to kill Paul Robeson. It was a horrendous incident in upstate New York, in Peekskill, New York, where they tried to have a folk music concert, where Paul Robeson, the famous Broadway singer who became an activist and a communist and was just one of the most well-loved, deep-voiced Paul Robeson, Pete Seeger, others, they tried to have a concert, and it was attacked by the McCarthyism. And Pete Seeger, despite being the most well-loved folk musician in the United States at the time, was banned from the airwaves. He couldn't appear on television, right? Because he was known to be a Communist Party member. He was a card-carrying communist. But that's what that relationship was about. And that the civil rights movement, and this is what's very interesting. So Elvis, right? We all know about Elvis, right? Many African Americans resent Elvis because he was singing the kind of music that was already popular among African Americans, right? Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog. He didn't write that. There was a black singer who wrote that song, but because she was black, white radio stations wouldn't play her music, right? All of the Elvis hits, that kind of music, that blues, rock and roll kind of thing, they wouldn't play it because black people did it. So Elvis, a good-looking white guy who can sing decently, has a good amount of voice, started becoming famous because he was white. That was the reality. Elvis became, his whole career, his millions of dollars, Graceland, was based on the fact that he was a white guy who could sing black music. And he admitted this, right? And that there's a huge amount of resentment against Elvis because of that. But Pete Seeger, it's a different story. Pete Seeger sang a lot of black music. He did. But he sang it at civil rights marches. Right? He used black music to encourage support for the black freedom struggle. And he was a very close collaborator with Ledbetter. And Ledbetter, was a very famous blues musician among the black community. So unlike Elvis, who kind of hijacked black music and used it to advance his own career, and Pete Seeger sang a lot of African-American music, but he did it in a way that helped the civil rights movement. And that's the difference. That's the difference. And it's fascinating to think about. But for me, I mean, that was probably the closest contact I had to communism when I was growing up. I know people, trust me, New York City, and I mean, I've known so many communists and all of that. These people that they grew up in the Communist Party, and then they joined the SDS, and then they joined some little sect or cult, and communism, they've heard it their whole life, and they went to a communist summer camp, and they did. I mean, that's not me. Really, the only contact I had with communism was folk music. I'm from the Midwest, and when I was a kid, my parents and we went to folk music concerts religiously. My parents loved folk music. It's just, I guess they're white, they're from the Midwest, this was their music, right? I mean, they liked folk music, right? And Irish traditional music as well. So as a kid, I would go to these folk music concerts, and I would hear Joe Hill songs, and I would hear Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie songs, and I did not know the politics of it. But that was where communism probably entered my periphery, was probably through hearing that music. That's probably the only way, really. If it hadn't been for that, I probably would have had no contact with it. And it was years before I discovered, years later, that Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and all of them had been Communist Party members. I remember the first time I ever heard the song Pie in the Sky When You Die, Joe Hill. It's kind of an anti-religious song that Joe Hill did, making fun of the Salvation Army. I heard it, and of course, having no knowledge of communism, none, right? I thought the message of the song, I thought it was like a libertarian song, right? Because the last verse is like, chop some wood, do you good, and work hard or something. If you work hard throughout your whole life, I don't know. I thought that the message of the song was, don't give money to the church, save and work really hard and make lots of money. I did not understand the political implication of it. And that's the thing, and that points to how things have changed, right? The Wobblies and the Salvation Army, at the time, you had all these migrant workers that were being exploited and going from town to town, and lumber yard and lumberjack plant, camp to lumberjack camp, being treated very badly, getting ripped off by their bosses, getting kicked out of towns, working to death in coal mines. And the reason that there was a rivalry between the IWW and the Salvation Army was because the Salvation Army was telling these folks that it was all a matter of fate, right? Well, your boss treated you well here, you got ripped off here. Here, you found some work and you were employed for months, and here you were unemployed and you were hungry and starving, right? And that life, when your existence is precarious, which it is for very low-income, desperate people, life becomes chaotic, and your existence is precarious. You live only so long as you can find work, and you find work so only so long as your existence enriches capital. And for people in a situation where they have only short-term employment, where they don't have a place to live, they're traveling around, life is very, very unstable. And it was during this time you had the rise of, they'd been around, but it was really an amplification of the tent revival, Bible-waving, Billy Sunday, right? Billy Sunday was a famous baseball player who became like a fundamental Baptist preacher, and he'd wave the Bible around and karate chop all the time as he's giving his sermon. That was really popular among the people the Wobblies were trying to organize because they didn't know, right? If you are in a situation where your life is so chaotic and you're so afraid of the future, you want something to make sense of it. And so you can see this, right? That superstition, throughout human history, superstition, magic, witchcraft, voodoo, right? All that kind of thing is something that people that have very, very unstable lives do in the hopes that they can bring stability, right? You don't know if you're going to eat, right, for the next month. You don't know if you're going to be able to find a job. But if you can, pour a potion and say some magic words and think that that somehow will help you get a job, you'll feel better. Right? And there's a placebo effect, too. Right? You might think, I have no chance of making it, but I'm going to do this magical voodoo ceremony, and in order to do that, that'll make it work. And maybe just you believing that you did the magical voodoo ceremony will give you the extra umph to go out there and do it, right? So it has kind of a placebo effect. But people in very, very, very desperate situations will want answers, right? And so this tent revival gospel message that, that God, you'll get pie in the sky when you die, just be a good believer and God will take care of you. And if God doesn't want to take care of you, if you end up starving, if you end up being unemployed, well, that's God's will. And you're suffering in this life, but you'll be happy in the next life. That kind of message became very popular among low-income people. And it was a popular thing to do, right? And the Salvation Army and Billy Sunday and this kind of tent revival meetings to calm and stabilize people who were very, very afraid and economically suffering, it was out there. But the IWW had a different message. The IWW was saying, no, you don't have to leave it up to divinity. You don't have to just follow the rules and wait for divinity to reward you. You can fight for a better life. You can organize to get better conditions. That was the message of the IWW, and it was a very different message. It was telling people that are down and out, don't, just donate money to these traveling preachers and hope that God rewards you for it and takes care of you. Organize. Resist. And that's why you listen to Joe Hill's music, right? Or you read Marxist literature from the Communist Party or the IWW or the Socialist Party. It's very anti-religious. Because the religious groups at the time were giving people that were desperately poor a very different message. And there was a difference. One group is saying, be obedient, be humble, and hope that God will take care of you. And the other group is saying, organize and resist and fight for your conditions. And those are two divergent messages. But what's amusing is that they used roughly the same tactics. They did. They used roughly the same tactics, right? As we know, the IWW went around speaking on soapboxes. These traveling preachers went around speaking on soapboxes. They sang songs. IWW sang songs. And who was Eugene V. Debs? Who was Eugene Debs? Eugene Debs was a traveling preacher. That's basically what he was. He went from town to town, giving speeches, firing everyone up, but he wasn't firing them up about Jesus and God and the Bible. He was firing them up about the evils of capitalism and the need to fight for socialism. But Eugene Debs was basically Billy Sunday, except a very, very, very different message. Right? Read about Eugene Debs, the father of American socialism, the hero of Bernie Sanders, right? He was the tent revival preacher of socialism. He was the Billy Sunday. He was the Billy Sunday of socialism. That's what he was. He was a traveling socialist preacher. And that was the reality of that situation. So I guess I've been rambling here about communism and folk music. There you go. But I think it's interesting stuff. I think it's worth talking about. I mean, folk music probably had a lot to do with me getting interested in communism. So I thought that was important, and I hope that was helpful. But I know some of you have just joined us. It's a bigger audience now. So if you just joined us, be sure to hit that like button. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, because YouTube has this algorithm of unsubscribing people. So make sure that you're still subscribed. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the bell. And I'm glad Space Communist enjoyed this. I'm glad Kinky enjoyed this. But, hit the bell so you get notifications so you're with us. We got a lot more to talk about. We got plenty more to talk about. But there you go. What else is new, folks? What else is on your minds? I've got a super chat to handle from the Eastern Communist guy. He wanted to talk about dialectics versus spirituality. I can get into that briefly. I'm happy to talk about that. Folks, Neon Noir says, I'm the best leftist YouTuber by far. Well, thank you, Neon Noir. I appreciate that. And I do my best. Let me put it that way. I do my best. And I respect other YouTubers. You know, Jason Unruhe and I don't agree on everything, but, you know, I follow his work and I see what he does. I follow BreadTube and, I mean, who else? I mean, there's different people out there, right? The Bad Mouse and the, you know, I pay attention to it. I pay attention to other people. I pay attention to that ContraPoints. But I also pay attention to people on the right. I pay attention to what you know, right-wing YouTube is saying too. I try to keep my ear to the ground. I try to pay attention to what's out there, and I try not to let the algorithms dictate what I see. And that's what you folks should do too. Make sure that I pop up in your newsfeed. Don't let them dictate whether or not you hear what I have to say. We know the algorithms are rigged. What comes up in your YouTube feed? What comes up on your Facebook feed? That's all rigged. We know the algorithms are rigged, folks. They're rigged. They don't want you to hear what I have to say. They're rigged. There might be some instances where I'm able to, you know, maneuver within them and get what I want, but it's rigged. It's rigged against us. It's rigged. YouTube is rigged. I sound like Trump. It's rigged. YouTube is rigged. We know YouTube is rigged, folks. It's totally rigged. So defeat the rigging. Defeat the rigging and make sure that you always see me. And I see I make people think you are the bestest YouTube. Hey, I'm doing the best I can, folks, but the bigger we make this audience, the more people we can get on board with what we're doing, the better, right? The bigger this is. So don't be afraid to tweet this out. Don't be afraid to, you know, to get people, you know, watching. Share this on Facebook. Share this on Twitter. Share this, you know, get people on board. Post it on Instagram. Post it on Reddit, for goodness sakes. I see people have been doing that, and good for you. I appreciate whoever's been posting this on Reddit and making this a bigger conversation. I really, really appreciate it. You know, this is a joint effort that we're doing, right? And that's why I'm very excited about this think tank that'll help facilitate the kind of conversations we're having here. I'm very excited about this think tank. I hope you can make it April 18th. If you can't, you know, I'm hoping to do it on the West Coast in a few months afterwards, but we're going to do it on the East Coast where I'm at first. I'm here on the East Coast. I'm in Brooklyn, not too far from the water. So there you go. But yeah, I mean, so someone asked me about dialectics versus spirituality. And I'm going to answer their question. I'm not going to get into too much depth because I feel like, you know, religion is a personal matter. Right? One's religious beliefs are deeply personal, and I'm not a pastor. I'm not here to push my religion on you, and I'm not involved in any organized religion either. I'm not a member of a church and all of that. But I was asked, so first of all, let's clarify. Let us clarify, first of all. Let us clarify what dialectics is. Number one. So, prior to Karl Marx, there was a figure named Hegel. Hegel was a German philosopher. He was examining history and how history works, and he came to the conclusion that history was like a train speeding forward. History was always advancing. There was historical progress. And at the time, that was a very controversial idea. The Catholic Church didn't believe that. Feudalism did not believe that. You know, feudalism did not believe in historical progress. If you look at what was preached at the time that feudalism dominated Europe, they did not believe in historical progress. Feudalism said there was a natural order, and that feudalism, the lords owning the land, the peasants as serfs, that was the natural order, and that kings were ordained by God to rule, and that feudalism was the eternal system. It had always existed, and it would always exist. And that was false, right? Before feudalism, you had the big slave empires of Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome, right? And Egypt even, right? And prior to slavery, you had, you know, primitive communism and hunter-gatherer civilization. So that was a lie. But coming out of feudalism, as there were uprisings springing throughout Europe and kings were being toppled and, you know, declarations of the rights of man were declared and you know, John Locke, life, liberty, and property, as these ideas are emerging, Hegel comes up with the idea that there is no natural, you know, system, right? Right? If you read John Locke thinks that there is you have natural rights, right? That the system that was replacing feudalism, the rights of man, well, this is the natural way. It's natural rights. This is the way it should be. It's the eternal reality. That's what basically the people that are overthrowing feudalism are saying, well, feudalism is the distortion. We represent the eternal reality. Well, Hegel says, actually, no. No. History is a train speeding forward. And that there is a clash. A clash. That first you have what exists, the thesis. Then you have something that cannot coexist with it, something contradictory to it, an antithesis. And the two clash with each other and they create a synthesis. Something new comes into existence. And that synthesis becomes the new thesis. And pretty soon it produces an antithesis. And the two of them clash. And from that you get a new synthesis. And that this process of change through conflict is the driving force of history. That is dialectics. That's the Hegelian dialectic. That's the Hegelian dialectic. The notion of historical progress, change coming through conflict, that is the Hegelian dialectic. And Hegel believed that Germany, the German nation state, was the highest thing that had ever come into existence. And he believed, he was not a Christian, actually. But he believed that Christianity as it existed in Germany was probably the highest form of idea. It was the most advanced synthesis. That's Hegelian thought. Pretty good. I don't disagree with a lot of it. I mean, it sounds good to me. Marx was really deeply inspired by Hegel. However, Marx was also following another school of philosophy. There was an old debate between idealism and materialism. Materialism says that matter, like wood, solid stuff, matter is all that exists. And that ideas and the human mind are a reflection of matter. That's materialism. Whereas idealism says the opposite. Idealism says that reality and matter is a reflection of the mind. Does the mind create reality, or does reality create the mind? That is idealism versus materialism. And, Descartes, for example, he said, I think, therefore I am. Right? My mind, my thoughts, creates my reality. Marx and the materialists said, no. You are, you exist, you have this thing called a brain, and so you think. Your thoughts are a reflection of reality. Reality is not a reflection of your thoughts. That was idealism versus materialism. And Karl Marx was very heavily involved in this debate. And Marx's philosophy was a combination of dialectics and materialism. And it's called dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism. And it's the belief that all that exists is matter. All that exists is matter, but matter is in a constant state of motion. A does not equal A. Right? That first A can never be the same as that second A. I've written it out before, and I will write it out. The dialectical materialism, as expressed by Marx, is the belief that A does not equal A. A does not equal A. There's no way that this first A can be the same as this second A, because all matter is constantly in a state of motion. The universe is constantly in a state of change. All that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion. That is dialectical materialism, and that is the Marxist philosophy. I think that overall, the overall view of dialectical materialism, the basic overall view, and as Gavin is pointing out, Heraclitus said it before, you never step into the same river twice, and that Hegel drew from Heraclitus, the Greek, philosopher who basically had a dialectical view. Basically, overall, I agree with dialectical materialism. However, I'm not as solidly a materialist as that. At the time that Marx wrote and existed, we were coming out of feudalism. Never before had materialism been allowed to triumph. Idealism was the belief, right? Under feudalism, it was believed that all reality was the reflection of the thoughts of God, right? All that existed was just a reflection of God, right? So pure idealism. The mind of God created the world. We're all just a reflection. Reality is simply the reflection of God. And because of that, right, there was constantly a belief that spiritual matters took precedence and material realities were widely ignored. And there was a battle for science and a battle for the right to speak materialistically, right? That was an ongoing fight that was happening, was the fight, the right to view things in a material way, the right to do science experiments and come to conclusions. Being a materialist in the time that Marx was alive was a radical thing to do. People did not think of human beings in material ways, that people had economic motivations, that people are motivated to rise up because they're hungry. Under feudalism, it was assumed that if you were hungry, you could make a good moral choice. You could starve to death, or you could become an evil rebel, and it's a moral choice, and you have to listen to the voice of God and just make a moral, that materialism and economic determinism and the belief that history is driven forward by contradictions and class struggles. No one had ever said any of this before. It was a very, very new way of thinking. And so he took it all the way, right? And that's why Marxism was absolutely opposed to any spirituality. And that's why there's a common critique, and you can get this from a lot of philosophers have criticized this in Marxism, right? Gramsci, right? Others critiqued what they call economic determinism, which is a big problem that Marxism has. Why are we doing this live here? What's the point? According to Marx, capitalism will just get worse. People will naturally rise up. It'll be in their material interest. There's no reason I should be doing this. This live, according to Marx, this live is a waste of time. Right? This is idealism. I'm telling you about socialism. That might motivate you to do something, but reality is not, ideas are not the driving force in history. So I shouldn't have to make this. I shouldn't be on here talking to you. If you take dialectical materialism and historical materialism and economic determinism to its logical conclusion, there's no reason we should be having this conversation here. It all just kind of naturally happens. But we all know that that's not true. That is a flaw in Marxism. Right? People take actions that are against their economic interests because they are motivated by a higher drive, by a higher value. People lay down their own lives to advance historical progress, become martyrs, become martyrs for what they believe is right. People like Che Guevara, people like Joan of Arc. That it's not just Marx, but everything that comes out of that period, because materialism was such an advance over what had existed before, because idealism and idealistic superstition had dominated all discourse prior to the rise of the 1800s, because of that, everything that comes out of that time period, and it was like boom, boom, boom. You got Marx, you got Darwin later. Shortly afterwards, you got Sigmund Freud. All of them are saying things that have never been said before. They're all making great, tremendous breakthroughs. Darwin is figuring out biology and discovering the way life evolves and adapts and changes over time. Huge breakthroughs. I am an admirer of Charles Darwin in many ways. Marx, obviously, I mean, I've got stacks and stacks of Marxist books here, and I'm a huge admirer of Marx. Sigmund Freud is understanding how the human mind works and, a lot of flaws, but he's getting to what motivates people, and he's understanding human beings and how they act. But Marx, Freud, and Darwin all see people as animals, and they're all tainted by their vulgar materialism. Under feudalism, it was assumed that human beings and animals had nothing in common. Human beings have souls. They have these magical things called souls, and so when they die, they magically go to heaven. And Marx is coming along and saying, well, actually, human beings are a lot like animals, right? Animals are motivated by acting in their own interest. Animals seek to reproduce, right? I mean, Darwin is saying, look, the descent of man and the origins of human beings, and Freud is saying, wow, people often have underlying desires and sexuality, and that they're all coming along and they're saying, wow, people do have biological drives. People are motivated by economic motivations. They're not just magical souls who can choose to obey God or not. They're all saying that human beings have a material basis to their existence, which before, you have to remember, you could be burned at the stake for saying that. So they are saying that human beings are like animals, and that at the time was very, very important to say. They needed to say that. Saying that at that time had never been said before, so it was super, super important that they said it. But they took it too far, and this always happens. I think they took it too far. I think that Marx's philosophy is a little bit too materialist. I do believe that people have spiritual motivations. I don't believe that all that exists in the mind is merely a reflection of reality. I think that the mind can also affect reality. I think that, the placebo effect is a real thing, right? It is. They've documented. If you think, they can give you empty pills and you take them, but you think it'll make you get better, and you get better. That there is idealism, that there is some truth to idealism. It's not what we thought it was, right? It's not pure idealism. If that was the case, I wouldn't be on here. I'd be like, going to see a sorcerer or something, right? I'm not an idealist, but hard economic determinism, hard materialism is flawed. That's all I'm saying, right? And that is where I am critical of Marx's philosophy. And that's why the person who asked this, the whole thing here just started because someone was asking me, how do I wrangle with this? And the reality is, I do believe that there is a spiritual motivation to a lot of what people do. I do believe people work against their own economic interests. I do believe that mankind is higher than an animal, that mankind is not simply an animal with a higher brain. I do believe that mankind is spiritually different than an animal. I do believe that mankind does possess something like a soul. I'm not saying I endorse, any theological definition of a soul, but I do believe that we are not merely animals. And I would think that Marx went a little bit too far with the materialism stuff. And I said that. I have a whole video. What was Marx wrong about? And that's one of the main things I said in it. That was towards the end. I said that was the main critique. And Darwin was wrong about that, and Freud was wrong about that too. However, overall, Freud made huge contributions to psychology. Darwin made huge contributions to biology. And Marx made huge, tremendous contributions to economics, to philosophy, to theories of history, So it's you don't have to. I've always said this, right? When it comes not just to Marx, but when it comes to Mao, when it comes to Stalin, when it comes to Lenin, when it comes to Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, you name it, we should study and understand all of them, but we should blindly adhere to none of them. You never, ever want to take on a state of blind faith. You never want to take on a state of blind faith. You never want to be in a situation where it's like, well, Marx said it, that settles it, and I believe it, right? There was a bumper sticker when I was a kid. People used to have it, and it drove me nuts. These evangelicals I grew up around, they had a bumper sticker that said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That is unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. And I know a lot of people, unfortunately, who replace the word God with Marx. Marx said it, I believe it, that settles it. Or Lenin said it, I believe it, that settles it. Or Mao said it, I believe it, that settles it. Or the leader of my small, isolated, ultra-leftist cult said it, I believe it, that settles it. If you do that, you are degrading yourself. Human beings are better than that, right? You are reducing your own ability to be a human when you act that way. That is childish idealism. There's a name for that. That is you are idealizing a voice and declaring it to be infallible. Don't do that with me. Don't do that with anybody, right? You should be able to analyze data critically and come to your own conclusions. Now, we don't all do that, right? I mean, let's be real. We all rely on the work of other people. We all study other people's conclusions and all of that. But at the same time, you have to be able to process information on your own and come to your own conclusions. And you have to be able to say, you know what, I was wrong. I was wrong. You have to look at it and say, you know what, I took the wrong position. I took the wrong position. One thing that I always used to say, you can actually find this in old speeches and presentations I gave. I said that the reason the Soviet Union fell is because it deviated from 20th century socialism. I said that the Stalin model of socialism was like the perfect way of doing things. I believed that, right? And that the reason the Soviet Union fell was because it deviated from it. That's malarkey, folks. That's malarkey. Right? I had it in my head that the way the Soviet Union was during the good old days when they fought the Nazis and built it up with the 5-year plans was somehow the magical, ideal way to build socialism. And during perestroika and glasnost, the Soviets were moving away from it and they fell. And, I mean, you know, is that the WW line? Is that the line of the group I was in? Not exactly, but kind of. It's implied. And I believed that. I was wrong. I was wrong. The reality is that really existing socialism, as it existed in the 20th century, had a big problem. Those problems needed to be corrected. The way they tried to correct it in the Soviet Union with perestroika and glasnost led to the Soviet Union's fall. China, however, was able to correct it in ways that didn't have that same result. Cuba and North Korea were able to adjust it in their own ways, but overall, there was a problem that 20th century really existing socialism, the Stalin political economic model, is not a long-term sustainable economic model. It was very, very successful during the 20th century. It defeated Hitler. It industrialized the USSR, industrialized China. I mean, it accomplished space travel. You know, so I get defensive. And I will. And whenever people say, oh, it failed, or everyone knows communism doesn't, no. And that's the thing. That's the danger. I'm being like Marx. I was being like Marx, right? I'm surrounded by people that are lying and constantly saying that socialism never worked anywhere, right? And so in my defense of my alternative position, I took it too far. Really existing socialism in the 20th century had huge achievements. In the USA, we never hear about any of those achievements. And so on that basis, I became a blind defender of that system. When in reality, there's a reason that system is not coming back. The reality is all the socialist countries of the world are moving toward a more Chinese or Vietnamese model. Whether it's Cuba, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Venezuela, nobody is going back to 20th century really existing socialism because despite all of its achievements, it has problems in the long term. It has accomplishments in the short term. The first 20, 30, 40 years of its existence, it's very, very strong, but it has long-term difficulties, right? It is not a mechanism for effectively working in the long term, right? And that you need a market sector, you need to bring in foreign investment, that you can't just do what Stalin did until the end of time. That's not ultimately going to work. Right? And that is what I didn't understand. And that's the thing. Just like Marx was surrounded by people that are pure idealists, he becomes a ardent defender of materialism. And he takes the materialism, in my opinion, too far. I took my defense of really existing socialism too far to the point that I just believed that really existing socialism was just the natural way. And what changed was when I started doing more journalism, and I started, I was working at the UN headquarters for a while, covering international events, and I traveled, and I went to Venezuela, and I went to Iran, and I went to Ecuador, and I went around the world, and I talked to people in countries that were resisting capitalism, and I realized that there was a huge amount of resistance to capitalism going on around the world, but none of it, nobody in these countries wanted to go back to that old model. And furthermore, I went to the people I associated with, and I began to increasingly realize the political people that I was surrounded with were stuck. They were stuck in a rut where they didn't know. The people I was associated with, you ask them, what's happening in Venezuela? They don't know. They don't know. Ask them, what is Venezuela? Is it capitalist or socialist? They don't know. Some of them will say, well, it's still capitalist, but oh, really? Well, then why? And then start asking them. So why does the state control the oil? Why do they have like a People's Bolivarian militias? Why? I mean, they don't know, right? They tried to tell you it's Salvador Allende's Chile. It's clearly not. Venezuela is not Salvador Allende's Chile. It's something different, right? They can't tell you. They can't tell you what's going on in Venezuela. They can't tell you what's going on in Iran. They can't tell you what's going on in modern day China. They don't have an answer. And the reason they don't have an answer is because they're stuck. And if you believe that the only type of socialism that really exists, that really counts, is Cold War socialism, you're stuck. You're in a rut. Because Cold War socialism is not going to ever return, right? Just like the Paris Commune is not ever going to return, right? The Paris Commune was tremendous. I'm for it. Did great things. But they never seized the banks, right? I mean, it had shortcomings. It was an advance, but it's not going to return. Soviet-style socialism had great advances, and we cannot let them lie about that. And that's what frustrates me so much, is that in American media, there's no admission that anything good ever happened there. They claim communism has always failed, it's never done anything good, and people just go along with this. And even socialists just go along with that and never challenge that. And that drives me up the wall because it's false. But Soviet socialism is not going to come back either, right? And that socialism with Chinese characteristics, Bolivarianism, right? These different forms of socialism that exist in the world today, 21st century socialism, is different. And that when we have socialism in the United States, and we should be talking about this, right? We can't just be observers of global events. We're not just geopolitical experts here. We think in global terms. We're constantly thinking about the future of our own homeland. When socialism comes to the United States, it's not going to look like Bolivarian Venezuela. It's not going to look like socialism in China. It's not going to look like Soviet socialism. It's not going to look like the Paris Commune. It's going to be a uniquely crafted model for the United States to address issues in the United States, and it will arise from contradictions. Socialism will be a synthesis. There will be things in U.S. society that cannot coexist with other things in U.S. society. There will be the old way that just can't go on. There will be people who cannot live in the old way any longer, and they will clash with each other. And out of that clash, that contradiction, will come a synthesis called socialism with American characteristics, or American socialism, or USA socialism. I don't know what it's going to be called, and I'm not 100%, I have some idea about what might be part of it, but I don't know what it'll ultimately look like. But that's how socialism will come to the United States. It will come because there will be contradictions within U.S. society. There will be the existing order, and there will be forces that cannot coexist with it. They will clash, and out of that will come something new and exciting, something that has never been seen before, something new and unique, something that is specific to our specific circumstances will emerge from that crisis, and that will be called socialism with American characteristics. And we don't exactly know, but our job is to figure out what that's going to be. That's our job. We have to figure it out. And that's why I want to create a new think tank. I want to facilitate the conversations about how we get to socialism in the United States. I want to be part of expanding the things that we talk about every week on these lives. I want this conversation to spread across this country like wildfire. I want people across the United States to start building and expanding this kind of dialogue, to start engaging with these kind of ideas, right? I want the young people that are campaigning for Bernie Sanders, that are talking about socialism right now, to do it with the information that we talk about on these lives. I want to facilitate conversations. Folks, I'm not involved in the electoral process. I do not campaign for anyone, and I don't endorse any candidate because I'm objective, right? I've predicted that I think Trump will win this upcoming election. However, I will say this. Between today and the election, there is going to be a lot of conversation about socialism and Marxism and capitalism in the United States. Furthermore, but if Bernie Sanders becomes the nominee of the Democratic Party, which right now looks very, very possible, it's more than possible. He's the front runner leading to Iowa. It's very likely, right? We don't know. But if Bernie Sanders ends up being the nominee, I mean, I feel like there's a good chance it could happen, but there's hell and high water ready to stop it from happening also. Let's be real about it. If Bernie Sanders ends up becoming the nominee, the conversation about the topics that we talk about on this live is going to go viral. It's like, you think, we're sitting here talking about Stalin and the Soviet Union and socialism with Chinese characteristics and Marxism and all of that. If Bernie gets nominated, or if, as the race escalates, and especially if Bernie gets nominated, these kinds of conversations are going to explode. Everywhere, people are going to be having these kind of arguments. They are going to be talking about these kinds of issues. And I'm sorry, folks, and this is what it keeps me awake at night. The forces leading those conversations are going to do it bad. They're going to do it bad. I don't want to name names here, but we've seen it, okay? How does every conversation I ever see on television about socialism go? There's an exception. Richard Wolff, in my opinion, is the exception. He's great. I like Richard Wolff. He likes me. I don't agree with everything. He doesn't agree with everything about me. I'm a huge fan of him, and when he's on Fox, he lets him have it. But for the most part, with the exception of Richard Wolff, with the exception of a couple others, every time there is a conversation about socialism on American television, this is how it goes. The libertarian says, yeah, well, socialism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And the capitalist goes, yeah, that's true, but... I mean, it's tragic. It's really, really tragic. And the premise of the conversation becomes, well, first of all, socialism is described as people getting free stuff from the government. That's not the reality. People get free stuff from the government under capitalism all the time. Socialism is the workers owning and controlling the means of production. It's when the economy is forced to serve public good and not profits. It is without profits in command. It is when the means of production operate for the benefit of society, not for the benefit of capitalists. That's what socialism is. And socialism, despite the problems of the 20th century, and there's no need to defend gulags, there's no need to say that nothing bad was done, but socialism has had huge successes. And when they just say, well, it's never worked anywhere it's ever been tried, but you and your arrogance, you think it can be done better this time. Are you a fool? And the socialists, first of all, they don't agree with that definition. They think either socialism is free stuff or socialism is me and my friends opening a co-op business. Right? So first of all, we don't get a clear definition of what socialism is. That socialism is a government of action that fights for working families and controls the economy to serve the people. That's what socialism is. We don't get that definition, number one. And number two, we get an understanding of the historical record that everywhere socialism has ever been tried, it just fails miserably. But you want to do it again because you're arrogant and egotistical and you're young and naive and don't have life experience like us sophisticated people. It's a wreck. The conversations about socialism in the United States right now are an epic disaster. They're painful to listen to. No one will point out that the emperor has no clothes, that socialism has had huge successes, that China, with its state-run planned economy, is doing huge, amazing things, number one. No one will correctly define socialism and say what socialism actually is, and the conversation becomes premised, it becomes a generation battle. It becomes millennials who want free stuff versus old people who think that they all need a swift kick in the behind and need to get their lives together. That's what the conversation becomes. And sure, there are some older folks who've seen it, and say, hey, these young people, they do have a hard time. They do need some free stuff. And there are some younger folks who buy into this libertarian garbage and say, well, blah, 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 blah. But largely, the way that they have framed socialism versus capitalism is millennials want free stuff. And old people say young people need a good spanking and a haircut. And that kind of conversation is a dead end. I hate hearing it because there's an element of truth on both sides. I hate to say it, right? On the one hand, young people need social programs. Every other country in the world gives people free health care and education. Every other country in the world. And the economic circumstances. Read Andrew Yang, right? I mean, the jobs are going away, de-skilling. The millennial generation, I'm part of the millennial generation, we're screwed. We're economically screwed. I mean, I am in a good situation, but I've had to climb, and it's been really difficult, But I've gotten where I am. But people I went to high school, do you know how many people I've gone to high school who have suffered from this opioid epidemic? I mean, do you know how many people I went to school with you should see what my hometown looks like. You should see what they've done to the Midwest. The malls don't exist. I mean, the roads are unpaved. You should see what they've done to this country. So the young people, the millennials, the Bernie Sanders crowd, they're absolutely right on that. But the old folks have something on their side too, which is that just wanting free stuff is not a good state of being. That part of being a human being is working hard and achieving something. And part of having dignity is accomplishing something, being proud of yourself, working hard, having something to believe in, making sacrifices for it is part of the human experience. And if you have a bunch of young people that are stuck in a cycle of low-wage jobs and can't support themselves, or they do support themselves, but they barely are getting by, and they're killing themselves, and they're taking opioids, and they don't know what they're doing, and you got a prison industrial complex, and you got pessimism. If you've got young people that are in this trap, and your only solution to them is, here's some free stuff. Have some free stuff. If that is the only thing you say to them, they're not going to get better. That is not what makes people proud to be human beings. That is not what gives people dignity. Here's some free stuff. Well, here's some free healthcare. Here's a free college education. Here's some free stuff. That does not give people dignity. Does not make children into adults. I feel like that's the crisis, right? I'm here, I got my own apartment, all of that, but I know so many young men that are stuck. They're stuck in this state of being like permanent teenagers, right? I mean, they're in this state of being where it's like they're working, short-term, low-wage jobs. They're living at home, and they don't have the ability to grow up and be adults, and they've been robbed of it because of the economy, and it's really, really tragic to see them. And of course, they deteriorate. Their mental health deteriorates. Their self-esteem deteriorates. They don't have dignity. And just giving them free stuff is not going to give them dignity, right? Just, Andrew Yang, universal basic income. Oh, okay, they all get $1,000 a month from the government. Oh, that'll help. They need the ability. They need the ability to be mobilized. If you look what socialism has accomplished, it hasn't been simply giving people stuff. If you look at what Roosevelt did in this country with the Works Progress Administration, hiring millions of unemployed people to build hospitals and schools all over the country. If you look at what Stalin did with the 5-year plans, industrializing the country, building it up. If you look at what has happened in China and what China has done, rebuilding the country, mobilizing, giving people the ability to go out and accomplish great things for their country and for their community, bringing people together, mobilizing them around a 5-year plan to make a better place, that is the amazing, amazing reality of socialism. Socialism has the ability to give people dignity, to give people pride in their communities, to make people feel like they have a purpose in life, to make people feel like they belong somewhere. Socialism made China great again. Socialism made Russia great again. Socialism made Cuba great again. Socialism empowers people. It makes them human. It gives them an identity. It gives them a cause. It gives them something to believe in. It mobilizes them. Folks, we need a government of action to fight for working families. And I will repeat myself. If you've already heard it, that's fine. 4 steps that would transition the USA towards socialism. And I want you in this moment to imagine what these 4 steps would mean for you, for your community, for your family. Step number 1, a mass mobilization of the population to rebuild the United States of America. Hire all the young people stuck in low-wage jobs. Hire all the young people unemployed. And what do you have them do? You have them build high-speed railway to connect the United States to other parts of the country. What do you have them do? You have them build new hospitals all throughout the country so people can get appropriate medical care. What do? You have them fix up our water systems so people aren't drinking lead in their water. What do you have them do? You have them go and rebuild our crumbling roads throughout the United States. What do you have them do? You have them build a new university system. So once again, we're churning out the greatest engineers and scientists in the country. What do you have them do? You have them pave new roads. You have them fix up the power plants around this country that are falling apart and crumbling. You put them to work making breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, making breakthroughs in nuclear fusion and cold fusion and new forms of energy beyond the fossil fuel market. You unleash them, you mobilize the population to completely rebuild the country. That's step number 1. Step number 2, oil, gas, coal, timber, all natural resources should belong to the people. Natural resources should become public property. And the money made from America's oil and America's gas and America's timber should be utilized to fund this project to rebuild the United States of America. The oil, the gas, all the profits from timber, from coal, should be organized and going to serve making a better country. And we should operate these natural resources in a rational way. Right? We shouldn't be operating them in what's in the short-term interests of the owners, but we should have scientists and engineers and people figuring out what's best for our communities and what's best for our environment and what's best in stopping global warming to manage our natural resources. Step number 3, the banking system. Right? We need public control over the lending of money. Right now, credit and lending is carried out by banks for the purpose of making more money. They lend money at interest in order to make profits. And as a result, we have an economy that is centered around people getting credit and getting loans to do business to make more money for banks. When someone wants to start a new business, when someone wants to take out a loan to do something, it should be based on, is it good for the community? Not, is it good for a bank to make profits? State control over lending. So number 1, loans are handed out based on what is in the interest of the community. And number 2, the revenue, the interest from loans, when it's paid back, goes into the public treasury so we can build more hospitals and schools and fund this project for national rebuilding the country. Step number 4 is to enact the Second Bill of Rights, the economic Bill of Rights that Franklin Delano Roosevelt advocated, the right to health care, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to employment. That is my plan to reinvent the United States. 4 steps. National mobilization to rebuild the country, public control of natural resources, public control of banking, and enactment of an economic Bill of Rights. If we did those 4 things, if 4 of those steps were put into practice, the state, the government, would have control over the economy. The economy would no longer be functioning on the basis of profits. Instead, with the control over the lending of money, with the control over natural resources, with a huge mobilized population, mobilized by the state, at that point, we would control the means of production. There would be private businesses, sure. I'm not opposed to private businesses. I don't think the government should run restaurants or hotels, but they would be subordinated to a popular power, a democratic popular power that would be strong enough to put the people first. People would come before profits. People would come before profits. If we enacted those things, the United States would be basically on the road to socialism. We would have a government of action that would fight for working families. Those 4 steps, think about that. Those 4 steps would transition the USA towards socialism. And at that point, the state would be powerful enough and would be leading a population that was mobilized, and greed and profits would no longer be in command of the U.S. economy. That would transition the USA toward a socialist society in which growth could continue. Growth could continue. No longer held back by the irrationality of greed. We would get rid of, global warming would become a thing of the past. We'd be off fossil fuels in a few years. Global warming wouldn't be a concern. We'd start trading with countries around the world on the basis of win-win cooperation. We would do business with Mexico in a way that would make Mexico a wealthier country and ourselves a wealthier country in the process. We'd be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. We'd be going to developing countries in the third world and helping them to industrialize, raising out of poverty. Instead of a military-industrial complex that tears down and destroys countries and makes profits from destruction, we would have a global economy based on win-win cooperation and friendship between countries. This is the future. This is the hope, right? And it is very possible, I think. It is very, very possible. And that's what I believe. And my understanding of socialism is very, very different from a lot of the voices we're going to hear. And those voices are going to get louder and louder and more amplified as we approach the elections. And the anti-communism and anti-socialism is going to get louder and louder and louder. Look, if the Democrats nominate Bernie, the Democrats nominate Bernie Sanders, not saying it's going to happen, but it's very likely, it's very possible. If the Democrats nominate Bernie Sanders, the election between Trump and Sanders is going to be 2 things. It's going to be a battle of the generations, number 1, and it's going to be a referendum on socialism and communism. And the old people who were from the Cold War are going to be hyped up into Cold War hysterics, and the young people, and it is going to become a generational battle, and it is going to become a referendum on socialism and communism. Bernie Sanders is not a communist. He's not a socialist. He doesn't advocate what I'm advocating here. He just wants to expand the welfare state. That's what he wants. He wants to expand the welfare state. And good for him. We need to expand the welfare state. I'm not against expanding the welfare state, but that's not socialism. But if the battle comes, young people, if they make this a generation fight, young people in the United States, our weakness is our pessimism. We are a pessimistic generation. We know it. Pessimism infects us as a generation. It is the curse of our age. Older folks, for whatever reason, despite everything they've seen, they still hold on to that American dream, that American optimism. And so it'll be young people armed with pessimism saying we need a bigger welfare state and I need more free stuff, versus old people saying these young people are spoiled little brats who are out of control and don't understand how hard we had to work, which if you look at, they were coming up during the early years of the Cold War, how hard they had to work, but that's a whole nother conversation. And the weakness on our side is the pessimism. Our generation is loaded with pessimism, cynicism, hopelessness. Whereas the old folks, Trump said, make America great again, right? Appealing to that optimism that people used to feel during the Cold War, during the Kennedy years, right? So you can't defeat fake optimism with pessimism, right? You have to have an optimistic constructive socialism. right? You have to have a socialist vision to rebuild the entire country. Not to restore the past, not to make America great again, but for the country to be reborn on new values, not settler colonialism and racism, but brotherhood and sisterhood, friendship with the people of the world, solidarity, right? It's socialism in order to be victorious. It cannot be, the world sucks, give me some free stuff. It has to be, we have a vision for a whole new America. We have a vision for working hard and sacrificing to build a beautiful world. We believe in the future. We believe in optimism. We believe in moving ahead. We believe in science. That is the only way socialism can be victorious, right? And if this is missing, we got a big problem. So folks, I've had fun here. I didn't know how this live was going to go. I've been in a little bit of a weird mood today, but I think I had fun here. I hope you had fun. I appreciate the super chats. I appreciate it, and thank you very much, everyone. It's been a good live, so best wishes to everyone. Please take the chance to tweet this out, share this, make sure you hit that subscribe button, make sure you hit that like button. We're having a great time today, and I wish you all the best. My best wishes. Thank you, Kinky. Thank you, Eastern Communist 1919. Thank you, Jenny Lynn. Thank you, Lady Ravenhair. Thank you, Martin O'Connor. We're doing great things here, but let's build this community. Let's fight for justice. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.